And I'd like to welcome everybody to the November 2025 DAS meeting. First thing on the agenda, do we have any new members who'd like to introduce yourself or people who are interested in joining or curious? Return that. Yeah.
I Ken Kepler. Just moved into the area.
Awesome.
Oh, right. You emailed earlier?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Glad you made it.
Any other?
Anyone else? New members or guests? First time?
My name's Daniel Barb. I've been in Delaware for about 5 years, but I'm just starting to get into astronomy and astrophotography.
Awesome. Daniel?
All right.
Welcome.
And I'm Roger Lankin. I took the astronomy course on Monday nights and Friday nights.
Ah, with Bob?
And yes, so I'm over here giving this a try too.
Cool. Very good. Welcome.
Jeff Oster. I was here last month, but I officially joined in the past few weeks.
Awesome.
I would like to talk with someone about how I get more involved.
Fantastic.
Very cool. Excellent. They hit me up afterwards.
And a note to everybody, but certainly for our new members and guests, at the end of the meeting, we always will break and head into our library across the hall for a social hour with refreshments. Also a great opportunity to chat, get to know each other a little bit better. So please don't be shy. We'd love to meet you a little bit better.
Yep,
Anybody else? Oh.
That we have astronomy workshops all the Tuesdays that aren't meetings like this one. So like next Tuesday, you can come out and talk to some people and they could help you understand astronomy better or astrophotography or anything that you're interested in with the subject.
Starting loosely after 7 o'clock.
That's right.
Loosely after 7 o'clock is a great way to describe it.
Yeah, and
exactly.
these meetings being a bit more formal.
You can bring grandchildren, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, why not? And do note that Mount Cuba also has like public nights every other Monday. You can check their calendar. So they'll have special programs. They have family nights on Fridays. I want to say a couple Fridays a month now, maybe 2 Fridays a month. But on their calendar, you can find all that information out. Yeah. All right. Next item on the agenda is dues. Bob.
I guess we're starting the dues collection process for 2026, and we've so far had almost 100 people sign up. So thank you for everyone who's paid their dues. It's what keeps the club going. I will mention that since Rob mentioned Mount Cuba, there's two structures. Mount Cuba, if you want to go to their programs, you have to be their member. But DOS members and Mount Cuba members are not the same. So don't get confused about if you join DOS and want to join Mount Cuba, you have to join Mount Cuba. So.
And we're not warring factions either. We're very complimentary.
We work together.
Join both.
Just since you mentioned that, I thought I'd mention that too. But so we are still collecting dues. If you haven't paid dues yet and you're on our list, you should have gotten an email from me last night with a reminder. There's a lot of different ways to pay. You can pay in person at any of the workshops or the meetings. There's a mailing address.
Or even tonight.
That was in the letter that you can mail it to, and also a couple PayPal options. They're both in the letter I sent last night and also in the focus. So if you go to the focus, you can get all that information too. So again, thank you for those who paid dues, and it's makes the program work. Thanks.
Very good, thanks. Next thing is the AP SIG. So you want to say something?
Okay, the next meeting of the Astrophotography Special Interest Group is going to be on December 13th. That's a Saturday. And the announcement will go out over das@groups.io. So any of you new members that want to hear about it, you need to be sure and get on das@groups.io right away.
Yep, that's the first thing you should do after you become a member. Join that groups.io and you get all sorts of communications, people saying, hey, you want to go out observing on a Tuesday or on a Wednesday? Or you want to go to this state park? You want to go to that state park? Or hey, you want to buy this thing? You know, there's all sorts of things that go out. So it's a very useful way of communicating. So definitely join the group. It's a great way to communicate. Next thing is book club. Mary?
Good evening, everyone. The book club will meet this Thursday, November 20 at 7 p.m. And we will be discussing the beloved book I would recommend to each of you, Starlight Nights, The Adventures of a Stargazer by Leslie C. Peltier. And it's the story of a young man, a telescope, and a passion to observe and understand the universe, first published in 1965. The Kindle edition, which is available for only about $10, has the David Levy foreword. And Davy knew Peltier in his later life and contributed the foreword to the 1999 edition. David Levy, the famous comet hunter, will be at our meeting to discuss Peltier. We'll also be joined by Bob Ebiescott, who is the curator of the Delphos Canal Commission Museum. He orchestrated the Peltier exhibit, and Peltier was from Delphos, Ohio. Andy Edelin, one of our new members of the DAS, and the author of a recent article in Sky and Telescope on observing galaxies in the summer triangle, will be the leader of the meeting. So you should have invitations and Zoom links. If you don't have them, please reach out. I've also scheduled an impromptu meeting on December the 4th with Professor Alma Zook to discuss her paper, Stargazing at Mansfield Park, to commemorate Jane Austen 250. So if you or your families, wives, girlfriends are aficionados of Jane Austen and would enjoy listening to a presentation by Professor Zook about stargazing and at Mansfield Park, they can join us. We'll also be joined by Marcia Bertushak, who had just joined us to talk about her book on black holes. And we'll have a final meeting December the 14th to discuss Christine Larson's paper on Tolkien and Aurora. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Next thing, Jim, you have any information about outreach?
Certainly. We have a scheduled outreach event with the Newark Parks and Recreation Department scheduled for this Friday, November 21st, from 7:30 to 10 p.m. It's called Cocoa and Constellations. Currently, there are about 107 people that are registered for this event. But if you've looked at the long-range weather forecast, it doesn't look like it's actually going to go off. I'll send an email to everyone that had expressed an interest to come out. I'll keep them informed whether we have it or not. But it's almost certainly scheduled to be cloudy, heavily overcast, they say. So we'll see. Miracles happen. So we'll see how that pans out by Friday. But I'll keep everybody informed. And that, I believe, is one of the last outreach events for the year that we have.
Greg, you have one, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Also at Bellevue State Park this coming Tuesday. It's 5:30. This is early because of some other scheduling of programs that the park had. Still, the situation is, it's very iffy for next Tuesday. If it goes, we can have a program over there and still do our Tuesday night workshop over here. So I could use probably 2 additional scopes, volunteers. My email is on the website, so if anybody can bring out a scope or 2 on as a backup, hopefully we get good weather. I will send out a go, no-go decision on before noon on Tuesday. So let me know if you can help. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. All right, do we have any other announcements? If not, that's the last one on my list. Cool. All yours, Jeff.
All right, I need 15 seconds of quick administration. We're not sharing, right? Yeah.
No, not yet.
I just want to get
Any help
things,
at all, Ian?
just need to get things primed here. Yeah, I found there was a couple tricks, but I think Let's see.
I'll put it in display mode.
Yeah, let's see if nothing else, we got the link, but. Oh, come on. Well, let's do this. If it queues up here.
The kids. I equated it to a four-step. Make a three-step.
Okay. So we might just have to swap over to this. Is that cool?
It's just a second.
So we will have that in the background. Again, it worked great on my computer.
It's right on mine too.
Yeah. Oops.
They have to
Go
help
back to
me get.
Yeah, no problem. We'll be good. Okay. All right, almost there. I just need to share. Let's pin this again and share screen. And we are recording, right, Rob?
Yes.
Cool.
I'll put it down and minimize the.
Do folks online see so it's the STS-51L Challenger disaster?
Yes.
Sure do.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Sorry about the little interruption there. So yeah, tonight's program is part 2 of our 2-part series. For those that weren't here last month, we were joined by one coworker of mine, Dave McGrath, who is joining us online tonight, who gave us a very interesting history of the role that this region, Elkton, Maryland specifically, played in the development of solid rocket motors. And from his talk, we learned that there's hardly been a space mission that a product developed and built at Elkton. Let me try to say that in a way that makes sense. Almost every single space mission had a component on it built by Thiokol, ATK, Northrop Grumman. It's the same company, many different names over time, has played a part in. So a really, really exciting history. And we really thank and appreciate Dave coming out to share us his 40 to 45 year history working at that company. So part 2, we're joined tonight by another coworker of mine, Sheri Hepler, also 40 to 45 years of experience at the company. And her beginnings at the company were quite interesting, and without stealing all of her thunder, a little snapshot. She actually joined the company not too long before the Challenger disaster happened. And while Dave's focus was actually on rocketry in Elkton, you actually started in Utah,
I
correct?
started actually in Huntsville, Alabama.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're going to be getting into that, so we won't step all over. But anyhow, Sheri had a unique and interesting, almost ground floor insight into what was happening. So Dave got to share some of the cool stuff that was doing. Sheri's going to be sharing, maybe one of our not greatest moments, but nonetheless, it's an important story. It's a very interesting story, and it's a story that I think everybody needs to remember. And there's some very important takeaways that she'll be emphasizing. So again, company I'm very honored to work at, and would like everybody to welcome Sheri Hepler to talk about the Challenger disaster. Oh, sure. You can use it if you want.
And we're just
You are all set.
clicking.
Page, yeah, should be good.
Alrighty.
Yeah,
Mouse.
yeah. Maybe click in here, and then spacebar should be.
Spacebar.
Yeah.
Alrighty. As Jeff said, I've got over 40 years of experience in solid rocket motors with now Northrop Grumman. Started out in started out actually in Thiokol before it became Morton Thiokol in Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville was, of course, a very interesting place here in the 80s. with the space shuttle because that's where NASA Marshall Space Flight Center is located, and they were responsible for the propulsion elements, the solid rocket boosters and the propulsion elements on the space shuttle. So besides working for Thiokol at the time in Huntsville, and actually our plant was located on Huntsville, on Redstone Arsenal, NASA Marshall was on the other part of Redstone Arsenal along with the Army. So I'm going to talk about the Challenger mission. This was, of course, a national tragedy. And from the looks here, I'll bet there's a number of people here that can raise their hand and say, I know exactly where I was when this happened. There's a few people that were not yet born, right? Reliving something very tragic for our nation. Again, very important. Going to space is hard. Okay, and especially with people, it is hard. So I wanted to start first with the mission patch. Every mission has a patch. It tells the story of the mission. Of course, before it actually flies. So we've got the space shuttle taking off from Florida, going around the world. You can see a comet in the flag. That is Halley's Comet. And you can see a little apple down on the bottom here, and that was for Christy McAuliffe, who was the teacher in space, the first civilian teacher in space, teacher that was going up on the space shuttle. And there, of course, we have the picture of the space shuttle as it's being launched. The mission for this launch was to deploy the TDRS satellite, tracking and data relay satellite. And then we have activities related to the Halley's Comet portion of the mission. There were some fluid dynamics experiments going on there with Gregory Jarvis, and then the teacher in space with Christy McAuliffe. So that was our crew, Dick Scobie being the commander, Michael Smith, the pilot, Ron McNair and Onizuka and Judith Resnick were the mission specialists, and Christy McAuliffe and Jarvis were the payload specialists on that mission. When you're going to space, this is not like flying an airplane. Flying an airplane has its own level of complexity, but this is much greater. There is a lot of mission planning, a lot of mission design that goes into it. And at this stage of the game, we're 5 years into the shuttle program, and they are trying to get to a more regular, routine access to space. There's a lot of pressure on the system that is used to flying one-offs, for lack of a better way to describe it, right? They started with the 1 and then they went to 4. They had planned for 12 in 1985, and 51L is the 12th mission. It flew actually in 1986 because they didn't get it done in 1985. Okay, but you can see we have different design cycles that we do, and you'll notice in this graph that the first mission design cycle started actually in June. Normally, it would start 18 months in advance. So this was a very compressed schedule to get the flight design done, to get all the hardware there, to get everything that they would need. You can't go out to your local Walmart if you forget something when you're in space, right? So there's a lot of planning to make sure that you have everything you need to cover all the contingencies that can also happen. So they were late in getting started, and actually in October was when Jarvis's experiments were added to the manifest for this flight. He was kicked off of the previous flight, 61C, so that we could fly a congressman. So a lot of changes as they were going through getting ready for this mission. And you can see over on the right-hand side the different activities that they had. So the first thing they're going to do is deploy the satellite. And then they're going to start the Halley's Comet activities. They've got a maneuver. They've got maneuvers they have to do, one to separate from the satellite and two to get into the right location for the Spartan deployment. Then they got to get away from Spartan, and then they'll eventually catch up to it again. They'll do their fluid dynamics experiments, and you can also see in there the teacher in space videos that they do. So pretty busy time for those folks was planned, but it's a very complex process to go through everything that needs to get done to get the spacecraft, to get the people, to get all the resources there, to get all the flight dynamics done as well. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of the timeline. 51L was postponed 3 times and then scrubbed once. It was originally planned for January 22nd. It got delayed due to the late launch of the STS-61C. And because of that flight was January 12th. There's a lot of processing that still is going on the Challenger mission. So it got delayed. You can't quite see that.
Yeah, you can just drag it out of the way. There
Drag
you
it out of
go.
the way a little bit.
Cool.
All during this process, they're having a series of meetings as well to understand what is their flight preparedness. On January 15th, they had what's called the Level 1 Flight Readiness Review. This was actually preceded by a Level 4 Flight Readiness Review that was held with all of the contractors at their facility, and then they would go to a Level 3, which was for THICOL, it was at Marshall Space Flight Center to get that approval. And then there's a Level 2, and then Level 1 is the final flight readiness review that is held. In that time, you basically got to go show NASA that you're ready to fly. Okay, that's the whole purpose of that. If there are any issues that are outstanding, any worry warts that people have, that's where that gets discussed. You'll see in a couple slides here, I'm going to talk about O-rings. Those of us that were there all remember O-rings. There was really no discussion of O-rings in this Level 1. It was something that they had gotten used to over time. And so there really wasn't much of a discussion of O-rings at the Level 1 review. On January 22nd, the launch date was slipped to January 25th and then later to the 26th due to Kennedy being some of their workload was not yet done. They needed some more time to process what needed to be done. And then on January 24th is when they had what's called the L-2 review. So that's launch date minus 2 days is what they do there. And again, they're looking for, is there been any change in the status of any of the hardware or any of the mission parameters that are needed to have a successful flight? And at this time, they had actually gotten back the STS-61C hardware. It gets the solid rocket boosters would be disassembled, they would be inspected, and the results from that are what was discussed. And in this case, the STS-61 data looked very good. They saw very minimal erosion to the O-rings on that particular mission. On January 25th, the launch date was slipped to the 27th because of weather at Kennedy. And that was also the day for the L-1 flight as well. Again, no issues were raised. It was given the go-ahead for launch. The weather was really bleak. The weather forecast was really bleak that day. And based on the forecast, they actually decided to postpone it from the 26th to the 27th. Okay, the 26th happened to be Super Bowl Sunday. So everybody down there was really happy about it, but the weather was beautiful that day. So then they go to the 27th for the launch. And they ended up scrubbing that because of a problem. They were very late in the cycle and they had troubles with the hatch handle. And it was a little bit of a Three Stooges kind of thing, watching them trying to get this handle off of the hatch. Had to use very sophisticated aerospace tools called the hacksaw to try and cut it off. Eventually there ended up being issues with the transatlantic landing sites, those kinds of things, and they ended up scrubbing on the 27th and recycling for the 28th. The weather forecast for that day was very, very cold. And the management team directed the engineers to go see if there were any issues with launching in those cold weathers, in that cold temperature. And there were at that time no issues identified. But part of all of this, you can see with the postponement of STS-61C and with all of the launch delays here because of processing, because of weather, workload timelines, NASA was taking a ton of heat. Or how are you guys ever going to get to 24 launches a year? You can't even do, 2 in a month, here. So they're supposed to go, 24 a year. Anyway, they were taking a lot of criticism for that. I did want to point out over there through all of that launch readiness review, again, the O-rings were not a big discussion topic. Okay. And one of the things you'll see later on, this is kind of a saying that at least wise I have in my work: beware the normalization of deviance. Okay, erosion on O-rings is not a normal design feature, but it had become normalized over time. You will see, I will also point out, I do try and give the sources for where I'm pulling this information from. If you haven't read the Rogers Commission, it's a pretty interesting read. Okay, talking about the weather concerns. On the afternoon, late evening of the 27th, Morton Thiokol informed NASA that they were concerned with launching with the cold temperatures that were expected. And in particular, the focus there was on the O-rings. They scheduled a teleconference between the NASA Marshall guys. Some of their people were in Huntsville, some were in Kennedy, and the Thiokol people, some in Utah, again, some in Kennedy. Teleconferencing at that time was a little more complex than setting up teleconferences now. We didn't have Teams, we didn't have Zoom. You had to go through an operator, and it was pretty challenging for those of us that had to live setting up teleconferences. It was a challenge. The meeting finally got started about 9 p.m. and the presentation went over the history of the field joints, the recent flight test data, concerns with sealing of the primary O-ring, and the timing function associated with sealing for both it and the secondary O-ring. The colder temperatures were going away from the direction of goodness. On 51C, which had been tested, STS-51C, that had been tested almost exactly a year before, that was the worst case erosion on an O-ring that they had ever seen. And the temperatures that day were cold as well. 53 degrees was the temperature for those O-rings predicted at the time of launch. The O-rings for the 51L were predicted to be down in the 27 to 29 degree level, so much lower than the 53, which was the previous fleet lowest history. Thiokol initially made the recommendation to not fly. They said, we don't think you should fly until those O-rings are projected to be above 53 degrees. That's our lowest history base, and that's where we want to stay. That recommendation was made by the engineers. NASA rejected the rationale that was given in that. And during the course of that meeting, the tone of the meeting became one of, don't prove to me you're ready to fly, prove to me you're not ready to fly. And you can't prove a negative, right? So the total tone of that meeting kind of changed. After NASA rejected the rationale that was given, Thiokol went on a caucus. And they caucused for about 30 minutes or so. And they came back with the recommendation for launching. Basically, what happened during that meeting was the management leadership took the decision to launch out of the engineers' hands and put it in the manager's hands. And at one point, one of the leading managers out at the plant asked the director of engineer to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. And they came back with the decision to launch, and the launch occurred. There were actually 3 reasons that night not to launch. The first being the cold temperature. The second being the seas were really, really, really bad. And with the shuttle boosters, they had ships out there to recover the boosters and bring them back. And they were actually heading towards shore because the seas were so bad. They were hitting 30-foot swells and things like that. So it was thought it would be too dangerous to try to retrieve the SRBs in that kind of weather. There was also ice all over the launch pad, and big pieces of falling ice can damage the shuttle, the tiles, other parts. So there were 3 really good reasons right there not to launch. The overnight temperatures on the left SRB were 25 degrees F. On the right-hand side, they were 8 degrees. And people go, how the heck does that happen? Well, you've got your external tank that's being filled with cryogenics. You've got insulation on them, but it's not that great. You've got a layer of cold air on that external tank. That cold air is dropping, and because of the way the winds were, it was getting that right-hand booster a lot colder than the ambient temperatures away from the cryogenic tank. So they're not flying at 27 or 29 degrees. They're not flying at 25 degrees. They're flying at 8 degrees. During the course of the discussion that was held, there was a talk about the lower specification limit for the motor. Specification limit was 40 to 100 degrees, I believe, at that time. Predicted temperatures well outside that. They had an argument about what that specification meant. NASA management said that's the propellant temperature. And Thiokol came back and said, no, that's our hardware temperature. It's also the propellant temperature, but it is the lowest temperature that our hardware has to be able to function at. And NASA still rejected the rationale, and like I said, we came back with a recommendation to launch. The icing concern was evaluated, determined not to be a threat. So launch was allowed to proceed. I've got a picture over there on the far side of the joint. Wanted to talk a little bit about that. So this is the exterior. If you guys can see my mouse online, this is the exterior of the motor. This is the interior of the motor. So we have what's called here a clevis and a tang orientation. When we make those joints out at the VAB, we have 2 O-rings. The primary is here. The secondary is here. There's also a port here so they can help test those seals to make sure that they are functional when they do the mate, that they don't leak. When the mate was made, the mate was good. They did not leak. one of the unfortunate features of this particular design is it has a material called zinc chromate putty that sits here between the insulation on the forward segment and the insulation on the aft segment. And it essentially acts to fill that volume and to prevent circumferential flow in that volume. But what happens when they mate the joint is the gas there has to have somewhere to go. So where does it go? It makes a blowhole. And so you will have a closed joint everywhere else, but you'll have one location where there will be a gas path that goes through there. And that's how the gas gets into the joint in this region. Does that make sense? So the other thing we need to remember is this thing is big. Okay. We're talking, what, 12 feet in diameter, right? They might be little tiny joints, but when they're on this big a diameter and you've got gas coming in one spot, you have a lot of volume to fill, and that gas is going to be going very fast. Okay, and that's how the O-ring gets damaged. The gas coming in and trying to go around, it'll try and it'll erode that O-ring. Those gases coming in are well north of, 5,000 degrees. Okay. So we are gonna try to.
Do folks online see the video queued up here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
To be able to click in.
Click down here, this on the way.
Maybe even right in the middle. Yep.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4. And the tower. Go and draw up.
That there. Go back to.
Slide.
Yep, that's good.
We're good.
Yep, we're good.
All right.
So that's pretty devastating. That guy's reaction, I think, is probably everybody's reaction. I know it was my reaction. Just absolutely devastating. Getting into the cause of the failure, as I've indicated through this conversation so far, the O-rings were identified as the cause. From roughly 0.6 of a second to 3.5 seconds, 9 little puffs of smoke were seen exiting the aft field joint, right in the vicinity of the strut that holds the right-hand booster onto the external tank. That black smoke is not supposed to be there. It starts out gray, it gets darker and darker and darker. That darkness is indicative of grease and insulation and O-rings being eroded and being burned. We see roughly 4 puffs of smoke a second. That's the first longitudinal mode of the motor or of the stack. And so that joint's being flexed. And as it's being flexed, gases are escaping. The cold temperatures and the way the joint rotated, it prevented those O-rings from sealing, at least for a while. There was also the potential that there was ice in the joint. I showed you the picture on the earlier slide. The clevis is this way, the tang is this way. While there's grease supposed to keep water from getting in there, there's the potential that water got into that joint and was frozen at the same time. When you start leaking gas, as I said, the gases are north of 5,000 degrees. When they hit cold metal, they are giving up their heat from the basic chamber as they go through this tortuous path. They're giving up their heat. So by the time they get to the O-ring location, they are cooling off. And the aluminum oxide in the combustion products precipitates out and actually formed a seal. So that actually acted as the seal for this joint for the first portion of flight. At T plus 37 seconds, Challenger experienced some really high winds, and it caused the steering mechanisms on the shuttle, both on the boosters and on the main engines, to be more active than they had in any previous flight. The main engines throttle down when they get ready to go through the maximum, what we call max Q, the highest aerodynamic loading. And so this little graph on the far side, this is the rocket motor pressure trace or thrust trace. And so in 37, so starting about here, you can see that we've got our thrust is tailing off, our main engine thrust is tailing off so that we can reduce the aerodynamic forces as we go through max Q. And then once we get through max Q, the rocket motor thrust goes up and they throttle the engines back up as well. So, you know, they're after max Q, things are increasing in thrust. And at 58.8 seconds, we see a plume coming out from that right-hand booster right in the location of that strut. The plume continued to grow. It's impinging on the strut. It's impinging on the external tank. And we actually are going to see a drop in the pressure in that LH2 tank. And, we get a catastrophic explosion at that stage of the game. That aft strut fails, and the nose of the SRM actually goes and impacts the external tank. So it's pretty well the cause was able to be reconstructed, which is really amazing. One of the guys I'm going to tell you about here in a little bit actually laid this out about 5 days after the Challenger disaster. So to give you a little bit of history of the O-rings at that stage of the game, as I said, I showed you the original design for the SRB engines. It's got these two rubber O-rings and the zinc chromate putty, as we discussed. The early analysis that was done for this configuration said the joint should close. So in that O-ring region, it should close. It didn't. It actually opened up, and it opened up by about 52 thousandths of joint rotation. We have to remember this joint was designed in the 70s. Finite element analysis was in its infancy. I know this because I worked on those codes. I worked with the guy that did the prediction. Okay. They had some issues with understanding the polarity of strain gauges that were on some of the test motors, and trying to rectify that with what the analysis was predicting. But they finally did figure out that that joint was rotating open and unseating that O-ring. STS-2, the second one, ever flown, had evidence of O-ring erosion on it. STS-51C, as I said, that flew in January 85, coldest temperature, the worst erosion that was seen on that. All but one of the space shuttle flights in 85 had indications, and some of them had indications on both O-rings and sometimes on both motors. So it was well documented. Dicol engineers had proposed programs to go redesign that joint. They presented to NASA Marshall, they presented to NASA headquarters. There were actually case forgings that were on order to be able to modify the design. But they just weren't moving fast enough and couldn't move fast enough with the launch rate that was being done. So it was well known that there were sealing issues across all the NASA centers at the time. And it was something that the engineers were paying really, really close attention to. Got a couple of graphs on here, some pictures. I'm going to move this again because I think it's a little bit in the way. So this is what the joint normally looks like. This one, I'm sorry, this graph has the exterior on the right-hand side. So it's a little bit different than, but since there's text on there, I can't flip it, right? But when we pressurize the rocket motor, this joint opens up right here. And you can see even the second one opens up here. So that's what it was doing. This right here, this graph shows what that delta gap is as a function of time. So you can see very early on, as right after ignition, the gap is pretty small. And then as that pressure builds, that gap opens up wider. The primary opens up to about 28 thousandths. The secondary opens up to about 16 thousandths. This chart right here shows you what the resiliency is of the rubber as a function of temperature. So if you take this particular formulation of rubber and you squeeze it and you get it cold, when you release that squeeze, it doesn't bounce back immediately. That's what resiliency is. It takes a while for it to relax back to its original shape. And you can see here, as a function of temperature, it's a small graph, I apologize, but oh, you really can't even read that on here. But at the colder temperatures, it takes a lot longer for that rubber to be able to respond and to be able to close up that gap that is developing.
What are the axes? I can't read the labels. What's the vertical and the horizontal axis?
Let me do this. I apologize. It looks so different when you're on a when you're on your own screen. So we've got what's called O-ring recovery as a function of time and as a function of temperature. So if our O-ring is 25 degrees Fahrenheit at 0.8 of a second, it can only recover 5 or 6 thousandths when it needs to recover 28. Yeah. So in order to recover 28 thousandths, it needs to be up here in the upper 50s, 60s, 70 degrees.
Yeah. Jeez. Thank you.
let's go back here. Um, so again, NASA Marshall headquarters were well aware of the issues prior to Challenger.
Click in the,
Oh,
yeah, for the first time, then your spacebar should be fine.
okay. After Challenger, the Roswell Commission was established to investigate the space shuttle program, and Thiokol's recommendation to fly despite having the O-ring issues. The commission later became a presidential independent commission investigation because they did not really have faith that NASA would be transparent in all of that. And it was with good reason, because
Very good reason.
they were not. NASA tried to sweep the O-ring temperature and O-ring erosion problem under the rug. And we'll see, I think on the next slide, Al McDonald, who was a Thiokol manager at the time, stood up and said, excuse me, we originally made the recommendation to not fly. That's when it became an independent investigation. On the Challenger, there are really two things you need to think about. There's the physics of failure. So we've talked about the physics of failure, what happens physically, and following the laws of nature. But what is the root cause? And the root cause really is a failure to understand safety, what the safety risk is. The culture at NASA and the management structure at NASA really did not allow people to raise up their hands and say, stop. Okay. They restructured it to keep program managers from being able to be pressured and to adhere to unsafe guidelines and deadlines. They started including astronauts on these panels. Previously, the astronauts didn't really have a voice, but the astronauts they're watching out for, their class, right? The commission also recommended that future spacecrafts have a means for crew escape. And for those of you who were here last month, you saw Dave talk about the attitude control motor that we designed and built down at the Oakton plant that gets the astronauts out of Dodge on the Artemis effort. So when you do a failure investigation, you always have to look at both the physics of failure and the root cause.
I think the biggest thing was politics. They had a teacher
lot
on
of
there,
politics.
and there was just pressure.
Well,
I thought
stealing my thunder.
I thought this would happen.
You're stealing my thunder. I've got another slide.
I'm sorry.
Coming up. Yeah, appreciate that. You're right. Al McDonald. Well, I'll put a plug in for his book, Truth, Lies, and O-Rings. Al McDonald was the director of SRM programs at Cape Canaveral in support of the Challenger flight. He was the one who was supposed to sign the certification to fly. And that night, he said, I'm not signing this. Somebody from the plant is going to have to sign it. And a gentleman by the name of Joe Kilminster, who was his boss, signed it. Al was the one that identified to NASA, there's 3 reasons you shouldn't fly today, not just one. He's the one that about day 5 of after the Challenger disaster, drew out on a piece of paper exactly the failure mechanism, including, the aluminum oxide precipitating out and forming that seal. During the Rogers Commission, when NASA glossed over the fact that there were O-ring problems, he stands up, raises his hands, and says, hey, Thiokol told them there were concerns with this. Now you gotta picture this. Al McDonald is there with the CEO, the VP of the plant, and like 3 other layers of management. He's probably the lowest level guy in the room for Thicol. And he stands up and says, wait a minute, stop, look here. He put his job on the line. Absolutely put his job on the line. He was the one that said the decision needs to be left in the hands of the engineers. And the plant manager was the one who took it out of the engineers' hands and put it in managers' hands. There were a lot of people affected by that tragedy. He was greatly affected by it. The engineers that were pulling that data together right before and trying to make that case, they were all devastated. They thought they did everything they thought they could to try and keep that thing from flying that day. This was what we call Al's personal warranty moment. Those of us that work in aerospace, when you sign a piece of paper, you're saying it's right to the best of your knowledge. And it's, you know, it's done the way it's supposed to be done. And, you know, he's like, I'm not signing that because I don't think this is right. There were other factors. So Ronald Reagan, July 4th, 1982. The STS is the primary launch vehicle for both national and civilian missions. The first priority was to make it fully operational and cost effective. Okay. That was a big challenge. That was a really big challenge. The US put all of its eggs in this one basket. Okay. The NASA Marshall managers were trying to live up to that. They were trying to prove it was operational. They were flying missions that the design work was done in 7 months instead of 12 or 18, which was more typical. The workload at Kennedy, you know, to turn these birds around was huge. NASA was very slow in developing a hardware and maintenance plan, developing the capability to allow that many missions. They couldn't get enough people trained. They couldn't get enough people hired to do that. They thought there would be some efficiencies, but they never really came to fruition from that standpoint. The resources were just strained absolutely to the limit. There was also the culture of can do. These are the guys that did Apollo 13. We can do anything, right? That's the attitude. It was not a culture where you could say no. We also had Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address scheduled for January 28th. And there was a lot of talk about he wanted to have a phone call with Krista McAuliffe up in space. Don't know whether that's true, whether that's not true. There were no records that were found of that phone call being set up. And that day, phone calls took about 3 days to set up. I'm sure it was probably on the agenda earlier before all those launch delays. And as those launch delays happened, that's when it probably got scuttled. Also going on that year, NASA put out a solicitation to the rocket motor industry to get a second source for the SRBs. And, you know, to help increase the launch rate. And they were offering the other companies a cost plus incentive fee type contract. Okay, and that's a huge thing in the contracting world. It's not a fixed price, right? You get reimbursed your cost, plus you get an incentive fee depending upon how well you do, that your profit, how well you do. It was estimated, besides the cost of the motors, it was estimated that it would have included a $60 to $100 million program to qualify those motors. And then the companies would have had to invest $200 to $300 million for the infrastructure to actually build the motors. Because it was a second source, Thiokol couldn't compete on that. Okay, but what they did instead was they put in an unsolicited proposal for a buy-3 set of motors for 66 launch sets with an option for 90 at firm fixed price. And it was at a cost that they knew none of the competition could do. Okay. All of this was going on, and meanwhile, the engineers are saying, stop, don't fly, right? Thiokol management was concerned about keeping the business as well. Okay. Big question. Could external influences have clouded the decision making? I'm not going to answer that. I'll let everybody else make their decision, but there's a lot of other factors that are going on. This instead was what Ronald Reagan got to do on January 28th. And I'm not going to read it because I don't think I can say it without crying. It still brings tears to my eyes, even today. And we lost 7 really extraordinary individuals that day. It's a national tragedy. I wanted to give a little bit about return to flight, STS-26. September 29th, 1988. 2 years, 7 months later. You guys cannot imagine how much work it was to get that thing flying again. And not just the solid rocket boosters. There were more changes that were made to the shuttle and to the shuttle main engines and the other parts of the system as well. So that stand down was probably good for the entire system to make the entire system safer. There were actually more engineering changes on the shuttle main engines than there were on the SRBs at the end of the day. But STS-26 Discovery flight, there were 2 findings related to the SRBs. Let me move this again here. So we've got our previous joint that we looked at. Here now is our new joint. So we had our clevis, we had our tang, and now we've added a capture feature on the inside. So this little element right, this little element right here is what keeps that rotation that they were having the problem with from happening. They also got rid of the zinc chromate putty in this interface, and they created a different feature here that upon pressurization helps to seal that area. They also put heaters on these joints, and they covered them with cork, but they tried to keep those O-rings warmer and to keep that joint at a good temperature. They also changed the O-ring material to be more resilient as well. So a lot of changes in that joint. It was proven out through static test. Works like a champ. The one thing they did see is they did see some little metal scratches on this. And they resolved that issue. And with the cork, they believe that most of that cork was lost at splashdown. There was one area that showed some darkness on it, and that would be indicative of aero heating that got on that. So that had actually been exposed during flight. They went and looked at other motors that were being processed, and they found some voids in that cork. And so they went and they did a repair of those, injected adhesive secondarily into that joint, and were able to solve that problem. But during the STS-27 flight readiness review, Rockwell makes a presentation that says they think damage to the orbiter was due to that cork. There were actually 400 identified locations on the orbiter of damage. And Al McDonald happened to be in there, and he was asked, "Thicol, what do you think about this?" And he says, "I think he's wrong."
Correctly.
Correctly, yes. STS-27 was allowed to fly. There was no cork missing off of those motors, and there was severe damage to those tiles. There was debris coming off of the nose cap of the SRBs. That was actually a product that USBI was responsible for, and there was also foam coming off of the external tank. They did a task force to identify the source. Again, most of it at the time was coming off of the nose caps. But as we all know, Columbia on STS-107 in 2003 was hit by a piece of foam coming off the external tank that hit the wing and punched a hole right through it. And now we had our second failure. Again, normalization of deviance. That foam was not designed to be coming off, and it was coming off, and they were not paying attention to it. So, lessons of Challenger were not learned.
McDonald's take on that,
Yeah, he was telling them they should have stood down flying.
period.
Yeah.
Because of that.
So, I think Al McDonald only stayed on the shuttle program probably another 2, maybe three flights. Then he went back to the day job he had when I worked for him in 1995. He was responsible for the project engineers for other projects besides shuttle. So it was quite an honor in my life to have worked for him. I've got in here some sources and other related materials. If folks are interested, again, if you've not had a chance to read Al McDonald's book, it's a really good read. It's very heavy. The paper is really, it's really dense paper. Again, the commission is a good thing to read. There are some other books. I haven't read all these, but I think I have seen some references to Diane that makes that probably one that I'll go look at and get a little bit different perspective. Some of the other people that were involved in the Challenger disaster. Roger Bougele, he was the lead engineer, saying don't fly with the O-rings below 53 degrees. He was the resident expert at the time on O-rings. Arnie Thompson worked very closely with Roger. He was in charge of the structures group at Thicol, very involved in the case, and was also helping to make that case. Joe Kilminster was Al McDonald's boss. He's the one that signed the flight certification for Challenger. Bob Lund, director of engineering at the time, the guy that said, as an engineer, I say don't fly. As a manager, I say fly. This guy, I also worked for him via Al McDonald. He actually had a thermal analysis background. That's where he cut his teeth. And I think predominantly all of these guys were engineers by training. I'm pretty sure Kilminster was as well. Jerry Mason was the VP at the Thicol Wasatch Division. Larry Malloy was basically the counterpart to Joe Kilminster. And he's the one that basically said, prove to me you're not ready to fly. Coming out of NASA. Judd Lovingood was in his chain of command. I believe very much he was probably involved in orchestrating some of the cover up. Sally Ride was on the Rogers Commission panel. The first female astronaut that we had. And Feynman's famous C-clamp experiment. For those that never saw it, it's very interesting. They were passing around a piece of hardware that had an O-ring in it. He pulled the O-ring out. He had brought a little C-clamp with him. He squished it with the C-clamp, dropped it in a bucket of water. About an hour later, he pulls it out and he says, this is exactly what happens. That doesn't have the resiliency that it needs. But it was, it wasn't staged. I mean, he just did that. It had to be staged a little bit because we had a C-clamp with him, right? But
Who doesn't always carry one?
carry a C-clamp. But anyway, it was quite a dramatic thing to see. These commission meetings were aired. And so we would go to work and then we would come home and we would watch the recordings of these for months, it seemed. So I think that's all the material I have for you guys. A little bit of charts on the flight readiness process. And that's it.
Thank you very much. And give me 15 seconds to take care of some brief administration and we will take questions. Hey, Rob, can you come up here? Guys online, I'm going to stop sharing, but I will.
Click stop the recording.
Where is?
Button right here in the bottom.
Oh, yeah. This one?
Yeah.